The 30 Ferdinand and offered the crown to the Calvinist Frederick V of the Palatinate. Frederick, later known as the Winter King for his short reign, accepted the offer. Ferdinand, who had by then become Holy Roman Emperor, was not a man to take such an insult lightly. He amassed a powerful army with the support of the Catholic League and his Spanish Habsburg relatives. The decisive confrontation came on November 8, 1620, at the Battle of White Mountain. The poorly organized Bohemian army was crushed in a short, brutal engagement. Frederick and his wife Elizabeth fled Prague, abandoning their brief royal aspirations. The aftermath in Bohemia was severe, with widespread confiscation of Protestant lands and harsh recatholicization measures. The war, however, was far from over. It was merely beginning to expand. Edict of Restitution in 1629. This edict aimed to restore all church properties that had been secularized since 1552. It was a radical move that alienated even some of his Catholic allies, who feared the emperor's growing power. The edict and Wallenstein's immense power created a new wave of opposition. This opposition paved the way for the intervention of a new Protestant champion, King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden. The Swedish phase, from 1630 to 1635, would dramatically alter the course of the war. Gustavus Adolphus was a military genius who had modernized the Swedish army. He introduced lighter, more mobile artillery, and emphasized disciplined firepower. Financially supported by France, which sought to undermine the Habsburgs, Gustavus marched into Germany. Initially, the German Protestant princes were hesitant to join him. This changed after the horrific sack of Magdeburg in 1631 by imperial forces. The city was utterly destroyed, and its population was massacred, sending shockwaves across Protestant Europe. The atrocity galvanized support for the Swedish king. At the Battle of Breitenfeld in 1631, Gustavus Adolphus shattered the imperial army under General Tilly. Power of the Holy Roman Emperor was severely curtailed, and the German princes gained significant Its conclusion marked the subordination of religion to politics. The 30 Years' War left an indelible scar on the collective memory of Europe. It was a brutal lesson in the destructive potential of religious intolerance and political ambition. The conflict began in Bohemia, with a local rebellion against Habsburg authority. Emperor Ferdinand II's commitment to the Counter-Reformation was absolute and unyielding. The Battle of White Mountain was a turning point in the initial phase of the war. Christian IV of Denmark's intervention was motivated by a desire to protect Protestantism and expand his influence. Wallenstein's army was a new kind of military force, a state within a state. The Edict of Restitution was a political blunder, overreaching and causing a backlash. Gustavus Adolphus landed in Germany, proclaiming he came to save Protestantism. Destruction of Magdeburg became a powerful propaganda tool for the Swedish cause. The Swedish victory at Breitenfeld in 1631 stunned the Catholic powers of Europe. The death of Gustavus Adolphus at Lutzen left his army without its strategic and spiritual leader. Wallenstein's assassination was a dark affair, born of mistrust and political expediency. The Battle of Nördlingen in 1634 re-established Habsburg dominance in southern Germany. Cardinal Richelieu's in 1628 was a rare setback for Wallenstein, a sign of his limits. The Swedish army's discipline was a stark contrast to the plunder-focused mercenary forces. The Battle of the Lech River in 1632 was another major Swedish victory, where the imperial general Tilly was mortally wounded. After Gustavus's death, Chancellor Axel Oxenstierna skillfully held the Swedish alliance together. The war spread to Italy, the Netherlands, and the Iberian Peninsula, becoming a true continental conflict. The witch craze peaked during the war, as social chaos and fear led to increased persecution. The experience of the war was The war's conclusion left Central Europe fragmented into hundreds of semi-independent states. Ultimately, the 30 Years' War demonstrated the catastrophic cost of settling disputes through armed conflict.